Russia has launched a military assault on Ukraine, hitting targets across the country.
When Putin launched his invasion of Ukraine, something unusual happened. Despite votes at the UN and widespread protests, there were some people who said it wasn't Putin who was to blame, but NATO and the West. The argument has found supporters on the left, on the right, and it's been one of Putin's main justifications for war. In the West, the most prominent proponent of this idea is a leading international relations scholar called John Mearsheimer.
Can you imagine 20 years from now a powerful China forming a military alliance with Canada and Mexico and moving Chinese military forces onto Canadian and Mexican soil?
That's from a lecture in 2015, one which has gone very viral and put Mearsheimer at the centre of a fierce debate. In this video, I want to look at Mearsheimer's argument that NATO and the West is to blame for this war. Doing this also gives us a chance to look at the highly influential idea of realism, an idea, like all those in this video series, that helps to explain the news on a deeper level. Okay, let's do this.
Vladimir Putin just invaded Ukraine because he didn't want Ukraine to join NATO.
Classic language of American realism.
Do the Russians bear responsibility for this? I don't think so.
I want to start with a puzzle. This is the North Atlantic Treaty, the founding document of NATO. It dates from after the Second World War, when Western countries clubbed together to form a military alliance to counter the USSR. The key part is here, Article 5, which states that an attack on one member is an attack against all. But here's the thing, it only applies to defence. If a NATO country attacks Russia, the other countries in the alliance don't have to help. So why does Russia feel attack from a defensive alliance? Welcome to Realism, a world full of conflict, one in which nation states have to be paranoid about security. In this worldview, it's hard to tell the difference between defence and aggression. Take for example the weapons the West was giving Ukraine in the years running up to the invasion.
We define these weapons as defensive weapons, but of course you all know that there's no such thing as a meaningful distinction between defensive weapons and offensive weapons.
Theorists call this ambiguity about what is aggressive or defensive the security dilemma. It means that while NATO might say it's just about defence, if you're Russia, can you be sure? What's to stop those defensive missiles, guns and tanks becoming attacking missiles, guns and tanks? It's like someone having access to your email or bank account. Even if they promise they won't do anything, it's just not a risk you're happy to live with. Mearsheimer cites other Western actions as also contributing to war, but this aggressive NATO expansion, that's top of the list. Okay, so that's the first point. A realist view shows you have to be paranoid. And in this context, that means understanding NATO expansion is not defensive, but aggressive. Okay, but how does this get us to war? And how do we know that removing NATO expansion would lead to peace? I mean, Mearsheimer is pretty confident that's all it would take.
It was NATO that changed the situation. Russia, as I said, doesn't have to worry much about Ukraine for strategic reasons in the absence of NATO expansion.
Mearsheimer's confidence is based on another aspect of realism, one I have to admit is kind of useful. You see, understanding other countries and their leaders is hard. There's history, domestic politics, ideology, but realism argues we should focus on something else.
The structure of the international system, it's the architecture of the international system that explains in large part how states behave.
For us as individuals within a state, the structure is hierarchical. There is a government above us that enforces the rules. But the structure of system for states is different. It's anarchic. There's no world government or police force to enforce the rules.
Another way to say that is, I do not believe that domestic politics, that the composition or the makeup of individual states matters very much for how those states behave on a day-to-day basis.
Mearsheimer is saying we can ignore all these factors because the hostile, anarchic nature of the system forces all leaders, good or bad, to focus on security. And why is this useful? Well, it lets us build a model. Look, I'll show you. Okay, so now we have the key concern for each state, security. In Russia's case, this means NATO expansion. Second, the hostile anarchic environment also forces states to act rationally. And the useful result? An ability to predict how states will act. In this case, NATO expansion will lead to aggression against Ukraine. This then is the second aspect of realism, an ability to predict how states will act. In this case, take NATO expansion away, no invasion. But if you continue, the results are inevitable.
We took a stick and we poked the bear in the eye. And as you all know, if you take a stick and you poke a bear in the eye, that bear is probably not going to smile and laugh at what you're doing. That bear is probably going to fight back.
Okay, so now we have the second aspect of this argument. Realism lets us model and predict how states act. And based on this, we know that if we stopped NATO expansion, we'd also have stopped the problem, and there would have been no invasion. Okay, so maybe you're already starting to see some problems with this. But before I get to why I think this all doesn't work, there's one last thing we need to look at. Remember this clip? How the US wouldn't like China having a military alliance and inviting Mexico or Canada to join it? Well, the idea here is that great powers have spheres of influence, areas near their borders that they expect to control. A good example of this is when Russia tried to put nuclear weapons in Cuba, and the resulting showdown took the world to the brink of nuclear war. Yet despite this, the West says it rejects this idea.
We do not believe in the concept of spheres of influence. We believe that it is up to Ukrainians to chart your own course toward your own future.
Rather than spheres of influence, Hillary Clinton is advocating for the principle of sovereignty. But realists like Mearsheimer don't have a lot of time for ethical principles in international relations.
For me, when you talk about great power politics, rights in the final analysis just don't matter. Might makes right. If there's a conflict between international law and a country's strategic interests, the country will always privilege its strategic interests, and international law and human rights will be pushed off the table.
In other words, states have to think about power and security, and ethical principles like sovereignty are irrelevant. So, the argument goes, while it might not sound nice to tell Ukraine to just do what Russia says, that's actually the way the world works. And if they don't, it's the West and Ukraine that's to blame for the consequences.
If you're a reasonably small power in the international system and you live next door to a gorilla, you have to go to great lengths to accommodate that gorilla.
За победу! Ура!
Okay, let's just recap the argument. Realism reminds us defense can be seen as aggression, so NATO expansion is a threat. We can predict how states will act, allowing us to see that NATO is the source of the problem. And if the West and Ukraine had admitted its power, not principles, that is the reality of international relations, and respected Russia's sphere of influence, war could have been avoided. And remember, if this argument is right, all that's happened in Ukraine,
a Russian airstrike on a maternity and children's hospital,
it's not Putin's fault, but the West and its supporters in Ukraine.
Local officials aren't sure yet how many people may have been killed or wounded.
The bodies of civilians left decomposing where they fell.
Okay, so there's lots that could be said about this argument, NATO, realism, but I want to focus on just 3 points that I think expose the simple and misleading story Mearsheimer is trying to tell.
Is there an argument to be made here that the West provoked Russia?
He said the invasion of this country was necessary and had been provoked by the West.
First, I agree that security is important, and what seems benign to us might not seem that way to others. So, for the sake of argument, let's accept that Russia, a country with more nuclear weapons than any other, really did feel under threat from NATO and Ukraine, and put that aside Mearsheimer's other points. But what's missing from this story is any Russian contribution. How about invading its neighbour Georgia in 2008, or invading Ukraine for the first time and annexing its territory in 2014? Do you not think some of this might have contributed to the current situation? And even if NATO expansion is a provocation, and we might expect some reaction from Russia, launching the largest European conflict since the Second World War, Mearsheimer, like so many thinking about Russia, seems to be affected by a reality distortion field. Anything the West does is aggressive and unnecessary, and anything Russia does is blameless defensive reaction. The security dilemma reminds us that defense can be seen as attack, but Mearsheimer is forgetting the ambiguity and treating all Russian aggression as defense. But sometimes aggression is aggression. Let's get to the second point. No NATO expansion, no problem. Mearsheimer's model predicted a reaction to NATO expansion, but it also made another prediction.
He did not have any intention of invading Ukraine. Putin is winning. Ukraine is never going to become part of NATO. That's just not going to happen. We now know that.
In other words, through his previous invasions of Ukraine, he'd stopped NATO expansion there and achieved what he wanted. And that's not all.
He's never said he was bent on conquering Ukraine. Russians are surely sophisticated enough to know that not only do they not have the capability, but that occupying Ukraine, occupying the Baltic states, would be like swallowing a porcupine. This would be crazy. So I think there's hardly any evidence to support that.
Not only was NATO expansion over, but it'd clearly be irrational for Russia to think it could conquer or occupy Ukraine. Because of these two reasons, Mearsheimer said there'd be no invasion. And in fact, that's been his prediction since 2014.
What they're doing is not trying to conquer Ukraine. There are many people who say the Russians are going to go on a rampage, they're going to try and reestablish the Soviet Union or a greater Russia, and so forth and so on. That's not going to happen. Putin is much too smart for that.
And yet, where did we end up?
Starting in the city of Kiev, there has been reports of explosions.
The column of Russian armor crossing into Ukrainian territory.
Something has gone wrong here. Maybe the issue is here, with the idea that decisions are made rationally. Certainly Putin seemed to miscalculate or have bad information. But for me, the real weakness is the idea that Putin's main or only concern is security and NATO expansion. After all, by invading, Putin has weakened the capability and prestige of Russia's military, hurt its economy, and strengthened the very military alliance he set out to oppose. It doesn't feel like Russia's security has been helped here. Putin gives off an impression of cool KGB professionalism, a man who thinks in a cold-blooded realist way. But this invasion seems to indicate that there's a lot more going on. Imperial nostalgia, personal sense of destiny. Like everyone else, I'm trying to figure it out. But I do know it's many factors that realism says we can usefully ignore. Of course, there was one group of people that had a wider sense of what Russia might do, the Eastern European countries. And after decades of Russian aggression and imperialism, this would make sense. In fact, it was the Russian takeover of Eastern Europe after the Second World War that led to the founding of NATO. Given this history, it just seems naive to think that if you'd removed NATO expansion, there's no way there would have been any Russian aggression. And in fact, it might have been even worse without the deterrent of NATO. Compare Ukraine's fate with that of the Baltic states, also former republics of the USSR, on Russia's borders with Russian-speaking minorities, but today protected under NATO, something that helps not just their security, but the rest of Europe too. But before all this focus on aggression and conflict in Russia's history makes you think that almost Mearsheimer's not being realist enough, it's also worth remembering that in 1991 different Russian leadership granted Ukraine independence. You know, this country, this core strategic interest that Mearsheimer's always telling us Russia would always fight to control, they just gave it away. In a number of ways then, Russia has acted contrary to how Mearsheimer's model, and perhaps realism more generally, predicts, which might be fine if Mearsheimer was treating his model, like other realists do, with some caution. But he's not. You remember this clip? When he said that there was hardly any evidence that Russia wanted to conquer or occupy Ukraine.
He's never said he was bent on conquering Ukraine.
Well, he actually said this a week after Russia had launched its invasion.
This would be crazy. I think there's hardly any evidence to support that.
Really? Hardly any evidence that Russia wants to conquer Ukraine? What about the big invasion on TV? Did you miss that? It makes no sense under Mearsheimer's model for Russia to be invading or conquering, so he predicts it won't happen. Then when it does happen, back comes the reality distortion field to make the evidence fit the model. Putin is the aggressor here. He did try and conquer Ukraine. It takes a lot of theory to miss the facts staring you right in the face. And finally, I think Mearsheimer is wrong about ethical principles. He says that might makes right, and ethical ideas like sovereignty are irrelevant. After all, the United States has acted contrary to those principles in the past when defending its own interests. It seems Putin felt the same, and yet his war is being hindered by sanctions and arms shipments driven partly by moral outrage at his invasion. Much previous Russian aggression had been in a kind of grey zone, but this was such a dramatic and bloodthirsty violation of the principle of sovereignty, it demanded a response. While I agree that thinking about ethical principles can't be separated from thinking about power, they still matter, and noting that countries are hypocritical doesn't change that. Sometimes looking at things in a realist way can suggest the world is inevitable, that ideas don't matter. But Mearsheimer's passion, anger even, suggests that deep down he thinks ideas have consequences. I agree with this, but for me the idea that has dangerous consequences is not the idea that some countries might want to choose their own future without being invaded, but an idea that ignores evidence that doesn't fit, that casts aggression as inevitable and blameless, and that says that those most to blame for an attack are its victims. Hi, thanks for watching. If you're interested in this topic, then I recommend checking out this video on the role geography plays in Putin's thinking. It's something that I think we underestimate, and like all the videos in this series, it's about an idea that will help explain the news long after today's situation has been forgotten.